This is Into the Storm, Triumphant Tragedy, Transformation. Buffaloes, not cowards. Buffaloes wisely fight into the storm, not painfully away from the storm like cowards or cows. This is raw, real, and rewarding with men with spiritual values. I'm Ryan Smith, your host, and it's my privilege to be with your co-host, Bunker Weimer. This is your podcast. By joining us, you join the community of post-secularism, vanguards for combining the one, Eastern religious and spiritual values with Western secular and scientific understanding. It's time to stop operating as if one is better than the other. We're really just talking about the same thing, operating with one objective, truth.
But before we jump into it, we want to let you know of even more incredible opportunities to learn and, more importantly, discover healing for yourself and those you love. You can learn more at www.tttransformation.com and theryancsmith.com for one-on-one coaching and large-scale speaking events to transform your relationship and your life. Be part of the action.
Yes, so let's get into it. Today we have a dear friend of mine, and I'm so excited to hear the insights with Jeff, who's a deep thinker and has introduced a book by Richard Rohr, Falling Upwards. And so we're going to talk about this book and how it incorporates into our life and your life. And this is really about, or how I see the insights of this, is dealing with grief when your model of the world does not match your reality and how to deal with that. So if I could start, Jeff, and we'll get into the insights of this, but first, why is this book meaningful or important to you?
So I read this book a few years ago, and at the time I was going through a lot of spiritual crap. Things like you described, it seems like your world's falling apart, things don't add up, don't make sense and everything. And at the time when I read the book, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. There was different ways of expanding your perspectives, of learning to see beyond what you thought. Like at the very beginning of the book, there's a quote that says I think it was Father Thomas Merton, that says that we spent all of our lives trying to build the ladders to, climb up for success or whatever, only to find out, halfway up the ladder or whatever, that it's leaned against the wrong wall. You spent all this time trying to get to something, and then you find out it's not at all what you wanted, or it's not fulfilling, or it doesn't give you what it was that you were looking for. And so I guess the thing that I would say that I got out of this book was it helped me to see that there is another side to life. When it seems like everything's falling apart, there is more beyond that.
Thank you. And if I could be real with you, and kind of this, maybe the reason why I love this book and why I'm so excited to share this is I feel like this captures a large part of the TTT, Triumphant Tragedy, Transformation. And how can our tragedies actually be beautiful? Like, that's a crazy thought. And today is answering that question. How can the seeming, like when your children, when a parent loses a child to death or to drugs or goes the way of all the world, you lose a job, you get divorced, any number of things, you get a chronic illness, you get paralyzed, suicide, these abuse, all these tragic things in life, war, all these things, like, where do you put that? What do you do with that? And this book places that into some frame of reference that I think gives hope to these seeming hopeless situations. On page 25, Richard Rohr, the author, quotes James Hollis, and he says this: The world is more magical, less predictable, more autonomous, less controllable, more varied, less simple, more infinite, less knowledgeable, more wonderfully troubling than we could have imagined being able to tolerate when we were young. And for me, I think there's been many tragedies and things that didn't go the way I have expected. And I'm going through that right now in my business, and it's been a lot harder than I anticipated, and that's been very difficult. And especially when I was going through my divorce and joining the military active duty, that was a whole new world that flipped everything that I expected on its head. And I expected that my life would be wonderful, and I would be preaching the gospel, and I would be learning all sorts of skills, making friends, traveling the world, and being like a missionary all over again. And it was, well, I guess it kind of was like my mission, because my mission wasn't like super glamorous and maybe what I had thought, but it, it was what I needed, and only looking back. And so, and I wish I actually shared this on our last week's podcast with Quentin, but I'm going to share it now. And that is, pain happens in your life when your model of the world does not match your expectations. But suffering happens when you do not have a plan. You don't have a solution to how to get out of that, or how to reframe your model of the world. If you stay stuck in your place, but your life is at a whole nother area, there is suffering. And pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice. And I hope that today, even the tragedy, the hardships that you're going through as the listener, that pain can, the suffering that you're in can be alleviated by changing your model of the world, and it just be painful, but not suffering.
Yeah, well, I think there's this idea in, you mentioned that this podcast is kind of the blend between the East and the West and these different ideas. There's this idea in Buddhist concepts that suffering is part of life. That you talk about pain being inevitable to everybody. And in the book, I think it was Carl Jung who was quoted that said, unnecessary suffering is caused by people's inability to accept that there is necessary suffering of just being human. Like, that's just just for being a human being, whether that be age, loss of a job. You listed off a whole lot of these other different things that could be painful, suffering, traumatic, experiences that we would much rather avoid. Human beings in general, nobody wants to go through that stuff, but inevitably something is going to touch our lives. Even if that just happens to be us getting old and frail and, going through those other different kinds of things. But there's this concept that they talk about in, it's called this concept, they call it the concept of the second arrow. It's not talked about in the book, but it brought about the same kind of idea that says—
What did you call it? The second arrow?
Yeah, it's called the concept of the second arrow. That the first arrow is the suffering. That's the pain that's inevitable about life. You're going to get hit with an arrow, something that causes hardship, pain, hurt, or whatever. But like you said, the difference between pain and suffering is that the suffering is when you don't have any plan, you don't know what to do about your current situation in order to change it. This idea of the second arrow is, I've been shot by an arrow. It's now lodged here in my shoulder, and I'm upset about it. It hurts. I don't like it. But the fact that I grab another arrow and I keep stabbing myself in the same wound point, and I'm just like, I hate that I was stabbed there. I was hit by this arrow, and it's not fair that it was me. And, this bad thing happened, and it shouldn't have been me that lost my job, or, whatever the case is, with whatever those things are, we beat ourselves up over it, and we inflict second arrow or a second set of damage, what you call the suffering or whatever, as opposed to just that normal pain that comes.
Yeah, the Buddhist term, they're the Four Noble Truths. And the first one is, life is suffering. And when you can accept that and anticipate it, it actually helps. But if you think that life is supposed to go your way and be wonderful, then your expectations are setting you up for disappointment. But if you can have a low bar, then it's only up from there.
Well, there's another quote in the book that says, by denying their pain, I forget which page it's on, they say, avoiding the necessary falling, many have kept themselves from their own spiritual depths, and therefore have been kept from their own spiritual heights. The human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling, changing, or dying. It's just like we want everything to stay the same. We don't want change. We don't like change unless we initiate the change because it's something that we wanted to improve. But like we don't like being told you're not in control of this situation. You don't choose that, and whether that be pain in relationships with dealing with choices that spouses make. They're like, I'm not in control of that, or it could be something that happens at work. Or in my case, my thing that was going on at that point was had to deal with faith and transitioning and deconstructing beliefs and things like that I had. That I saw the world through a particular lens and was like, this is how the world makes sense to me. And going through and finding things that didn't make sense or that didn't line up with those things, that was causing me unnecessary suffering with this. I didn't want it to change. I liked the way I viewed everything, that I saw that, and hanging on and clinging to that desire to see, like, if things have to fall apart before they get better. I think that's kind of the general overview of the book, is that the counterintuitive or paradoxical advice is that you have to fall down to go up. It's like you go down to go up. And conversations that me and you had years ago, you had mentioned, and you had told us this idea of the hero's journey, where you start out with life and everything, and adventure calls you. And eventually you go past and you descend down and you fight your battles or do whatever, and then you reemerge on the other side, and it's kind of like this spiraling circle that goes over and over. But when you reemerge, you're back at the same place, but you're not the same you that was there to begin with. You've been retooled. You've got additional skills, knowledge, and things, so that you can take the lessons that you learned through all of that fighting, the story, the bad guy, whatever else, like all of that stuff that comes with it, you bring it with you. And now you can be there to either help others, go through the same kinds of experiences, work through that stuff, or to enable you to better respond to future challenges and things that will arise, just because life has those difficulties.
Wow. So fun to see that. Yeah, I think this whole book, to me, I loved it because it just, the concepts that I learned through the School of Hard Knocks, this is not something I learned in master's school or my master's programs. But this book really made a lot of sense to what I don't know if I can say intuitively know, but what actually happened through me and my transformation, and what people would say, oh, you have to have tests to testify. And I was like, and I'd be like commiserating and be on my victim soapbox and like, have pity for me. Like my ex is bringing hell on me. And this is like, I can't consider a worst fate. I had a close friend lose her, and hopefully this doesn't seem insensitive, but from my perspective, so this isn't objectively true. This is Ryan's perspective. But I remember when I was in the fog of my divorce, and I remember one of my close friends, her husband died in a car accident. And she it was devastating to her and her family. And that was a traumatic thing. And I was quite young when I had been part of that. And at that time when it had happened and I heard about it, I was like, I can't imagine a worst fate. But then when I went through my divorce, I was jealous. I had wished that I had maybe had that tragedy opposed to my tragedy, because at least she had loved and lost. And I feel like I loved and lost, but the loss was like a choice. Like we didn't have to get divorced, where the car accident was out of their hands. And now the loss wasn't so much of you can't talk to them, they're on the other side of the veil. It's they're sending you hate emails, and they're sending court uh things that, like, I was like, really, this is the love of my life, and now this is like, I'm losing all of my income and my sanity, and this doesn't have to be. And I remember that being a feeling very difficult. But I will say, it's not fair or right to maybe compare tragedies. They're really apples and oranges. They're not. But anyway, that was my ability to articulate just how painful that loss was.
Well, and I think that's universal across all things. Like, you may start out with something, you may say like, I've had family situations or whatever where family have not had the best of health. There's been health struggles for them, whether that be surgeries or illness or, other things like that. And it's been really hard for them. And yet at the same time, it's just like, oh, like a situation like ours. And it's just like, oh, like I lost a business and I lost, different things like that they were working on. It's like, man, it feels like my struggles are so much worse than, whatever the other people's are. But it's because you're not going through their stuff. Like everything is kind of geared towards what's going to help you ultimately grow. And going back to the book, the book's called Falling Upwards, and he talks about that there are two kind of phases to life. That the first phase of life is all about its identity. It's, who am I? What's important to me? He describes it as building a container. And I think that a lot of us do a really good job at this, trying to just say, hey, we've got this container, this is all these things that we're trying to do. This is what's important to us. And the second half of life, he describes as filling the container. It's finding the contents that fill the container. And something that I've listened to him, or at least some podcasts or things with him and other things that are on there, that he's elaborated on this idea that we get in this idea of thinking that first phase of life, is better than second phase of life, because you don't have to go through the darkness, or vice versa. People that go through the second phase of life are like, oh, those poor first half of life people, they just haven't been awakened to what's going on. And it's neither good nor bad in that sense. It's like you can live a very happy, fulfilling life in first half of life, but eventually something happens to you. We've described all these painful, traumatic things, and it's at that choice in the hero's journey and those cycles and all that. You can reject the call. And, you could, Han Solo, for example, in Star Wars or whatever, he could have been like, okay, I'm not going to take this passage. I'm going to keep doing my little thing. And he would have been completely fine paying off Jabba, never been frozen in carbonite, like all the other stuff. It would have been a completely different take on the story had he not engaged in that. Or same with Luke, just staying on Tatooine or whatever. But I think those stories resonate with us because each of us have this idea or this obstacle, that time that says when life gives you those difficulties and then that pain arises, you have a choice. You can choose to fall down. You can choose to accept the call, go through that journey and work out all of those difficulties, and then come out on the other side, ironically, higher than where you fell, beyond that stuff, because you found the contents that your container, your identity was meant to hold.
Yeah. And if we could come back to that, and maybe just kind of express maybe the kind of overview of the book before we kind of maybe talk about these concepts. But even like in this movie, Star Wars, he lost his sense of normal, his status quo life, and the paratroopers, the stormtroopers, they murdered his family that he knew, and the farm that was there. How can that be a beautiful thing? But because of that, he was able to rise to an occasion and save the galaxy, right? And in the moment, he wouldn't have been able to say, oh, it's a good thing that the stormtroopers murdered my uncle and my aunt that I've known since I can remember. That's not a good thing. But looking back, it led to the path that brought better beauty and saved many other lives.
So what's the kind of advice that we give to people when they're in the situation of Uncle Owen's been shot and killed, like Aunt Beru's there, like in our case with real life, we've got the pain, we've got that. How do we engage in conversations that help individuals understand that there's still more to the journey, to have hope with some of those things, and not just get hopeless and be like, you know what, it's not worth it. Like the pain it's really raw, because just because you get shot with an arrow, to use that example, doesn't mean it's like, okay, well, at least I'm not second arrowing myself, so to speak. But it doesn't stop the fact that there's a big arrow in your shoulder and you're bleeding, and there's still pain and stuff that goes through that. Like, there's lots of traumas that come through that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And just this week, listening to on the Come Follow Me episode with Hank Smith and John By the Way, they had their interviewer, Dr. Lily de Hotis Anderson. And Lily, her first name, she said this, and this is the answer that I would give to someone, when they're just at the end of their rope, just thinking that nothing could be worse in their life. And, curse God and wish to die. There's times when I've been close to that point, and it's like, it can't get any worse. Like, I can't see a better way out. And, and I tell my clients, that's the difference between stress and something better of just a hard time. Is stress is when you don't have a solution. A hard time is when it's just painful, but you believe. And so this is my answer. And the short answer to that is faith. So let me just say this is the dark night of the soul is a thing. In Matthew 6 and 7, Jesus brings out, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor do they spin. And even Solomon in all his beauty was not arrayed like one of these. And think of the sparrows. God knows every sparrow that falls, and you are worth so much more than many sparrows. So if he knows every sparrow that falls, he is aware of you. And sometimes you don't have that solution, the bigger perspective to see how you're going to save the galaxy, and how this is going to transform your life for the better. You're not going to have that at the moment. And that's why it's hard. And even my favorite scripture is Jesus wept. And, Mary didn't know that Jesus was going to bring Lazarus back to life. She was in the dark night of the soul, and it was hard for her. And even Jesus, he wept and felt her pain. But he did have a solution, and he knew. And you have to sometimes learn to trust. And that's level one. You need to choose to believe faith over your fears in the shadow. Don't forget it. The tsunami of doubt that you cannot see, that lack of seeing, that's what faith really means. Faith means, what's the scripture in Hebrews? Faith is not to have a perfect knowledge of things. You have faith. You don't have that sure knowledge. So if you choose God, he has already chosen you. And I think of the quote in the Count de Monte Cristo, I don't believe in God. Well, he believes in you. And you need to believe that even when you have faith in faith, is like what I say. It's like sometimes you have nothing, but you got to just hold on to the rope. And I have another story to share about rats about that. But your faith must be stronger than your fears. Your fears are real, and they can take you to dark places. If you listen to your fears, you start doing some crazy stuff, like murdering people, revenge, and you let your emotions take charge, then you're not going to end up in a good place. And you're going to be asleep and and begin to be numb because the pain is too real. And so your faith must be stronger than your fears. And so I have more to say. And maybe my story about the rats is there's a Harvard study. They had a rat and they had it in an aquarium and they just let it swim until it was just about to drown. And just before it like took its like last breath and it was choking on water and just about to go down, the scientist picked up the rat, caressed it, put it under a heat lamp, gave it some food, and nourished it. And it only lasted, I think, this first time, like 6 minutes. And then once I think maybe a day had gone by and it was nourished, had some time to recover, the next day they put the rat in the same tank. How long do you think it lasted? 2 minutes, 6 minutes?
It was hours, wasn't it?
60 hours.
Yeah.
60. So it had moved from
Just a few minutes.
6 minutes.
just a few minutes to several hours because what had changed?
It had hope that it would be saved.
It had faith in faith. It now had this confidence that it could go forward, and so it exponentially changed the rat's ability to fight. And that's the message for today. Is that when you're at the end of your rope, you got to believe that there's something going to be there to catch you, and there is some beauty even when it looks like a big tsunami just ready to crash your world, and it is crashing your world. It's not seeming like there's a reason why people are shaken and fearful, because the past bad things happened and you have those evidences. Nobody's crazy, but you got to be, your faith has to be stronger than that.
And so you would say then that faith is different than just getting through, because human beings, I feel like, are really resilient in general. I know when I would look back on my past and I start looking at some of the darker times, that were there were days when it felt like the sun, I wished that I could control the sun. Like it's nighttime, I can take a break, I can go to bed, but I knew in the morning the sun was going to come up, another day was going to and it just kind of like perpetually pushes you forward, and you're like, here I am again, and you're like, now I got to make it through another day, and you make it through the day and it's nighttime again, and it's like, please just don't start the day again, and the day comes up again. So to someone in that situation, what is the difference between just making it through and having the faith in faith? What would you say?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Jeff, for that place. Because I've been there just wanting, just sleep is like such a beautiful thing, because my reality is it's harder than I have. It's beyond my skill set. And I don't have the ability to confront the challenges that I am now in. And if I want to be responsible and like actually like consciously aware of what's really going on, the only choice that really seems to make any sense is despair and hopelessness. And yeah, sleep is very beautiful because it's like this escape, like you can just turn it off for a moment. And so your question, Jeff, is what do you do in those times when life is more difficult than you can handle?
Yeah, along those lines, just you were mentioning obviously that like we need to have faith in faith, right? And so I was just bringing up the story that people will get through things. Like people made it through World War II, people made it through the Holocaust, terrorism, sickness, health, things like that. That those things can happen, but they don't necessarily emerge on the other side a changed individual from that process. I think that because you were mentioning that, the quote from Count of Monte Cristo, he was like, I don't believe in God. And he was like, well, God believes in you, right? That God is always there for you, in the sense that invites you into this second half of life, invites you into the change, invites you, but ultimately you have to go there. And so you can be faced with the difficulties, you can be faced with the hardships, but choose to not engage in going there. my question was more, what's the difference between the individual that chooses to go down that route versus the individual that just makes it through battle scars and everything, but they didn't go down the they didn't go through the journey, if you will. Does that make
Oh,
sense?
great question. Like, is there a difference between someone that has faith and someone that listens to their fears or doesn't listen to faith? And what are the other options?
Yeah.
And addictions are a thing. Like Bunker, Jeff, Ryan, you are susceptible to embracing an addiction in your life. And you probably already danced with it already. And I know I do. And like there's a reason why people have addictions. And why do they have an addiction? An addiction is anything that's going to numb you from your responsibilities in life and where you can't be present in what really matters in your higher priorities. And I feel like the stereotypical, alcoholic, or an addiction can be food, it can be sex, it can be TikTok, clothes, shopping, cars. And I think we've talked about they can be, I think there's actually the 5 idols that maybe I'll talk about later that we maybe for another day. But anyway, people fall to addiction. And the reason why is because these addictions numb them from having their eyes wide open, feeling the total pain and the gravity of their life. And so it's so easy just to take a shot of whiskey or whatever and numb yourself from feeling the heartache from when your ex left you. There's a reason why people go to the bars and just drink their sorrows away. That's what they're doing, is they're not facing. And so what we're really offering to you, the listener, is the other alternative to addiction. If you don't embrace what we're talking about, what other option do you have? And that is an addiction. You're going to fall in, you may not be an alcoholic, but you're going to be a holic, workaholic. You're going to join something anonymous and join a club of the other zombies and robots that are all around us. And most people are asleep and they just go through the motions of life. They go through life with their eyes closed. And the problem with that is if you can't feel the pain, you also can't feel the pleasure. And you've seen the robot, the Iron Man, the caveman Daves, they're just, I am Groot. And like, they have like no ability to connect with other people. And that's because that's how they've treated themselves and their pain, and they become hardened. And the Book of Mormon there's a great scripture in there that talks about through the many wars and the Alma chapters, life was so difficult, so hard that for some people, they became so hardened and calloused and prideful. But there was others that became very humble and contrite, and they really put their burdens on God. And when life is easy, it's like a flat plane. And it doesn't really matter if you're a cynical Eeyore, depressed person, or a optimistic person. But when life starts to get really, really hard, you cannot, like, your default and your choices, like, you have to make a choice. And that's what tragedy does to you, is it brings the mirror, the Michael Jackson, you got to look the man in the mirror in the face. And am I a pornographer? Am I a smoker? And if you don't make a conscious decision not to be that, then you'll fall into the path of least resistance. You'll go the way of the water, paths of least resistance, unless you make a choice to climb up, because the pain of life is too hard. And so with that, maybe Jeff, can you explain like this first half of life versus the second half of life and what that really means?
So yeah, the first half of life, like I said earlier, a little bit, was just you building out your identity, what's important to you. You're like a soldier. You get your values, your directives, and everything from outside of yourself generally. Others build up the framework for you so you can, who's important, what's important, what goals should I have, like, so you've defined what success looks like to you in life, and like, you've built this ladder, this roadmap of this is what a successful life is going to look like, A, B, C, D, whatever the case is. And as you begin to move throughout that life and you start checking off and doing all of those things, you start to feel better about your identity. You tie your identity to, these things, like, I've got stuff, I've accomplished things, like I am something here. And part of the struggle with it, he uses an analogy in the book of what he calls the loyal soldier. So, you're in war and you're a soldier, you get your orders from everybody, and okay, captain, I'm going to go out here, I'm going to go do all these things. But eventually the war ends, and you're sent home. And now you're like, well, wait, like, who's telling me what to do? What's going on? Where do I get my values? The war ending in this case is the opportunity. It's the intro to that hero's journey. It's the call to come. It's the traumatic event. It's the loss of the job, the divorce, the whatever the thing is that's happened, that makes you, or gives you, presents the opportunity to say, are you going to embrace this second half of life? Because that first half was building the container, building your identity. That second half now is all about, he uses another phrase in there. He calls it order, disorder, and then reorder. So the first part of life is all about ordering everything, getting it all put together, and then disorder happens. And none of us like disorder. We don't like when things aren't going the way we want. And so life happens, and we have to go through that disorder process. We try to skip it, and we try to just go back to reordering, building up a new framework or new identity somewhere here, instead of dealing with I think he calls it shadow work. There's a lot of what he says actually is that your shadow is what you refuse to see about yourself and what you do not want others to see. It's like a double blindness that keeps you from seeing and being your best and deepest self. And you kind of were mentioning, that you've got all this potential, but because you've got these blinders on here, like it's easier for us to be judgmental of others. It's easier for us to be less forgiving of other people because we see our shadow in the world. We see the things that are unhealed or resolved or whatever in ourselves, we see out there. And so one other thing that he says, if you have forgiven yourself for being imperfect and falling, you can now do it for just about everybody else. If you have not done it for yourself, I am afraid you will likely pass on your sadness, your absurdity, your judgment, and your futility to others. And that's kind of where he's talking about that decision point between moving from first phase to second phase of life, that you have this, once you go to the second phase of life and you've done all of the things to build up your identity and everything, and then disorder happens, your life comes to fall apart, and you start to see everything differently, and you start to go through that disorder, pulling things apart, where it feels like you're moving further away from God or further away from, things that are important to you or whatever, only to then realize that as you start to reorder and put things back together, it's that falling to come back up. Sometimes they call it falling upwards. And as that starts to happen, as you start to see that maybe things are a little bit different, you can start to work on your shadow. You can start to not be so affected by the things that are going on out there. You yourself, you don't take offense as easily because you understand that there's a bigger picture. You know what the rules are, so you know how to break the rules. Like, when is it acceptable for me to say, like, hey, I think Jesus did a great job of a lot of these different things that, you've got these rules here that they say, hey, you don't do all these different things, but he's like, we're hungry. Like, it makes no sense here to not do this. Like, we're going to take some corn out of the field and I'm going to feed you here. Or he's like, I can heal this man. He's on the Sabbath. Well, he's like, so what? Like, why does that mean I can't heal the man? Like, it was made for us. He understood the purpose of the rules, or the the laws or whatever, so he knew when and how it is okay to break them, because like you're going beyond the law to see beyond what's there. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Bunker, any thoughts that you want to share?
Oh, I've enjoyed just soaking all this up. I have a lot of different thoughts, but I guess just as someone who has not read this book, I'm trying to put the pieces together of like what are the important things that you guys are trying to convey to the audience. And so I guess to put my own words to it, partially it seems like you're trying to say that, hey, that there is a benefit to all the tragedy and pain that we go through, because it can be viewed as a positive thing down the road. Maybe in the moment it's tough, but afterwards you'll be appreciative of it because of all the things that'll profit you. So the way that I envisioned it was like pain and suffering. This is what digs a well. And then the love and the capacity that you've grown from that pain is the water that fills the well. And without it, the well wouldn't be profitable to anybody else. But since you have that, then you can share. And I think too, getting into the two halves of life, that makes a lot of sense, because I think especially coming from a religious background, there's a lot of people that really struggle with that once they start to kind of, I guess, redefine things, try to see where things fit. And just as you were explaining, Jeff, like Christ did a great job of saying like, hey, like these are the rules, but like we can do these, like why not? Because he saw like the greater purpose or the greater good of it. That can be hard for people to reconcile, I think, because you're raised with these strict rules, a to-do list. You do these things, you don't do these things. And then over time, you kind of have that fear built into you of, well, if I don't do this, what's going to happen? And it's hard. I think it's really difficult. I think that's where a lot of people go through a major faith crisis of saying, hey, I've been told not to do all these things, but if I do them, I don't see any bad in it. So what's the point? Anyways, I think that was kind of like where my thoughts went, where as a listener or people that I get to interact with on a daily basis, I just had an interesting conversation with a good friend not too long ago. She was talking to me about guilt. She's like, oh, like, I'm surprised that you're still active at church being like a 27-year-old single guy. And I was like, well, like, I like it. Like, to me, it makes sense. Like, there's a lot of, it's all good. Like, I don't have any negative drawbacks for it. And then, but what about you? She's like, oh, I just felt like I was so guilty all the time. And I was like, oh, interesting. Like, explain to me more. And I think it was her trying to reconcile the in-between stages of her two halves of life, right? She's stuck in the one, trying to figure out the second one. And now she's in the second one, and she's, I guess, separated herself from religion and spirituality, and she's feeling a little lost. And so she's like, well, I have to incorporate some of this, but I don't want to incorporate the parts that make me feel guilty, and it's like that give and take, that push and pull. And I think that's a very human side, but going full circle back to Christ is that is the whole point, right? Is like, we kind of have to transcend what we're thinking. We have to go to a higher place. And I think if I'm gathering it, that's kind of what this book is talking about. And I think too, adding on to what I just shared, is when you guys were talking about addiction and different things, I thought about the quote from Brene Brown. She's the one that says that the antidote to addiction is connection. And I think a lot of times when people are numbing themselves, it's because they're not connecting, and maybe there's a fear of that connection or where that might take us, or having to put the effort in to get that. And I think that's maybe why it's been so important in AA, is the first step is to surrender to a higher power. Because it's like, hey, this is all hard. This is all pain. This is all suffering. But we don't have to give it meaning always. We don't have to make it make sense. We can let that be taught to us. And over time, it'll work out. So I don't know. I love listening to this conversation, because even though I have not been able to read the book, I think it's benefited me just listening to you guys explain, because these are very valuable points for any listener, especially for the audience that we have of men and spirituality, trying to incorporate post-secularism, the East and the West. It is a difficult challenge, but those are my thoughts. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk of my spiel.
If that's a TED Talk, then I don't know what we've been doing.
That was awesome. Bruce C. Hafen, Emeritus General Authority, January 24th, 2017, gave a talk called Faith is Not Blind, a BYU forum. And it's this concept of simplicity on the other side of complexity. And he kind of said, like, there's kind of three phases. Is like there's simplicity, like a primary, like go to church, do this, and then something traumatic happens. And where does this simplicity of the gospel match up with like people abusing you, and like how do I confront that? And we kind of talked about that, you know, how to turn the other cheek in a prior episode. So so go back and listen to that. But then, you know, so you have the something traumatic happens, and then how does this simplicity principles you learned in primary actually supposed to be a guide for you in that? They don't make any sense. But if you stay with it long enough, you'll find out that like love is really the answer. Even in the face of war or other really complex, challenging things. And it does require, you can't be intellectually or spiritually lazy. And it requires you know, you have to graduate to a new level, but you are going to go back to these same basic truths of that you learned in your, so it's like simplicity, complexity, then simplicity. And that's kind of what we're talking here about this. There's two halves of life. Is in the first half of life, you're just a soldier. You're just kind of taking orders. Go get a job, have a family, survive. You know, like that's like the main, that's your marching orders. And you're just doing what you're supposed to do. And that's hard to do. Just living up to that standard. But then something crazy happens. You lose your job. You've been trying your best at your job, and then you get fired. And you're like, what? Even my best wasn't good enough? What more can I give than my best? Then it drives you crazy. And that's when despair starts to take over, unless you replace it with fear, or your fear, you replace your fear with faith. Excuse me. Your faith must be stronger than your fears. And to me, this book made a lot of sense in helping me put in perspective ego. For me, I kind of like ego wasn't good or bad and like makes sense, but where does it place? And this to me made a lot of clarity to ego, where if you let your ego do everything, which your ego says, I'm number one, I want lots of significance, me. And that's a good thing that gives you a hard drive. It's like a soldier, work really hard. But if you only let your ego play out in a tragedy, you're just going to go into revenge. And like, sometimes it's bigger. And, you know, any Hollywood movie about revenge, if their tragedy and their ego takes over, then they become the villain, because they're trying to control what they cannot control, and they try to kill the murderer, and then they become the murderer themselves, and then they become the very thing that they hated. So that's not the answer. So what is the answer? And it's going back to surrendering, or what did you say that your soldier, Jeff?
The soldier gets discharged. It's like
discharge the honorable soldier. So the very thing that helped you aspire to love your parents or whatever and then you lost your job or whatever you loved, your ego was actually the thing that helped you work so hard to create the sandcastle. And then the wave came of life and it took away what you loved. But if you use that same soldier, that same ego that helped you create what you love, you're going to become a villain. You're an addictive, you're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to become something evil. And you're going to be numb to life. But if you can discharge your honorable soldier and then take on the next phase of life, the second half of life, which is caused by tragedy, and you expand your container and your worldview to somehow allow, even though I don't understand what I'm going through right now, somehow, some way, my container that has now been shattered will make something beautiful out of this. And what's the Japanese pottery? They like take these perfect cups and then they intentionally shatter it, put tragedy to it, which would seem like a stupid thing to do, but you're laughing, Jeff, so I think you know what they do. Do you know what they do?
Yeah, that's when they use like the gold or whatever, and they like put it all together so that you can. It highlights the cracks, it highlights the things, but the cup's been put back together, but is more valuable because of the gold and the other different things around it in general, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So like the tragedy was the triumph, and the thing that kind of makes it, no cup is quite the same, and it has these golden veins going through it. And so I think that that's beautiful. And I think this story, or this book, as we're kind of wrapping our thoughts up here now, is I um, I loved how something that I didn't actually really know that I had a problem with, but he highlighted something that didn't make sense to me, and he made a lot of sense out of it. And in the Old Testament, Moses has the 10 Commandments, which is a first order of life. The Old Testament is a first order of life. And do you know the commandment that I'm going to talk about, Jeff?
I'm just going to let you go. I was just smiling.
Okay. The commandment is in Exodus 20:12, honor thy parents, that thy days may be long upon the land. That's a first order, not a first, or a first phase,
First half of life.
first half of life. Thank you. And you got to honor, and that's the honorable soldier, right? To honor your parents. But when Jesus came and presented the second half of life, what did he say in relation to your parents? Matthew 10:37 gives a seeming contradictory commandment. He who's not willing to forsake these, in reference to mother and father, is not worthy of me. So he's basically saying, dishonor your parents. What? It doesn't make sense. But it makes sense in the context of the first half of life is like just do the right thing, and it's kind of like very simple, like, as a child, that's what you need to do. But as you get older, you need to distinguish and differentiate yourself from your parents, and you're going to have to choose God even over your internal wiring to be loyal to your parents, and kill or cut off, or you're going to have to create some boundaries even from your parents and choose God over your parents. And that, to me, I think really highlights like this complexity, but from the seeming simplicity of the gospel.
Yeah, one other thing to note about this is they talk about the first and second half of life, but this does not necessarily mean, hey, if you're under the age of 40, you're in first half of life, and everybody over 40 is second half of life. Like, there can be people that stay in first half of life all their life and live very happy, fulfilling lives. And there can be people that enter the second half of life in their 20s, because something challenges them or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter whether or not you go to first half of life, in your 40s, your 60s, your 80s, whatever, and vice versa. There are times that one thing that he does say is that if you don't do the first half of life well, if you haven't figured out the identity, if you haven't figured out how to build the container and everything, it's impossible for you to move to the second phase of life. And so like you try to skip over that, or it's missed for some reason, something is going to bring that back to us, that we need to build that first phase of life. I think that was also an interesting thing to put.
Yeah, the better you can do the first half of life, the more prepared you are to do the second half of life. And if you are shoved, pushed, traumatically abused into the second half of life in your childhood, when you don't have the cognitive ability, you may never be able to really do the first half of life right, and then therefore jeopardizing and making it extremely difficult to get into the second half of life. And you can't really do the second half of life right if you have not done the first half of life, which I thought was really crazy. And it talks about, like, you need to feed your ego. There needs to be a place where your ego gets its heyday and it has its time in the sun, and go get the job, go make your millions, so that you can give it away and then say, that's not really what life is about. But if you never really have that moment, it's hard to put it away. It's you kind of have to love and lost before you really know what love is. But if you can't really have like a true love if all of your loves like are perfect, because love is kind of mostly defined when people are not nice to you and unloving to you. And I think that that's beautiful. And Lily, kind of from this, which I've really loved hearing her, she talked about in this Come Follow Me episode, she talked about grace to grace in her book and how there's three mentalities. And I think this really goes into these first half of life, second half of life. And she said there's a terrestrial. No. Sorry. The lowest is outer darkness. But in life, there is telestial, the glory of the stars. And then there's a terrestrial, glory of the moon. And then there is a celestial, glory of the sun. And we are living in one of these three codes of conduct. And we're living in these heavens right now. And you may be, and the lowest one is the code of conduct of the telestial is follow your wills and your whims and let your ego do whatever it wants. Let your ego run wild. And the problem with that is if you do that, you'll end up in jail. And you're going to hurt people because you're just being a selfish, my way or the highway, selfish, bad words come to mind, but you have no bridling your passions. That's the first with the telestial. The terrestrial, the glory of the moon, this is like the first half of life. And that is, you have to have your passions, but you have to bridle them to operate in society and stay out of jail and, get an income, be a contributing member of society. And that is a terrestrial existence. And it's doing the right thing. But there's a higher order, and this is the second order of life. Their second half of life, second half of life. And that's the celestial code of conduct. And that is doing the right thing for the right reason. It's loving your neighbor because you actually really do. Not just because someone else told you to, or you have your home teaching or ministering assignment and you're letting your ego, doing it for significance or to be praised of men. That's like a terrestrial mentality. But a celestial is like, I actually really have the right desire to love my neighbor, love my enemies, because that's who I really am. And that's a celestial code of conduct. And you put away anger, you put away these things, and you try to be perfect. And I believe Jesus, when he's talking about perfect, he's not talking about the world standard of perfection in that you have the perfect house and you have the perfect external symbols of success. Perfection in the Matthew 5:48 reference is that you are perfect in your internal world, and that your meekness, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness. That's the perfection he's talking about, and that you have the right intentionality to the onslaught, the tsunami of life, and that you meet it with meekness, humility, hunger and thirst after righteousness. And maybe one podcast in the future will really expand love is long suffering. But you really incorporate the magnanimous spirit of a Christian character, and that's perfection. And so to summarize, I think that the second half of life is going to have this celestial order that may not actually look any different. You're still going to hold the job and you're going to go to service projects like you did in the first half of life or as the terrestrial person, but the intentionality in the heart, the calmness, the faith is totally different. And that's kind of the difference between this alpha and beta character. Is like the alpha, whatever happens, they know that they're going to be okay even when they lose everything, like Job. But the terrestrial beta male is going to freak out when bad things happen, and they're going to let their fears go crazy. And if we're honest, we're all have room to improve there. I know I do. Any other thoughts before we wrap this up?
Good.
I think that was perfect. Yeah.
Well, this has been wonderful. I hope that you can take these things and really recognize that your psychology must match your pain. And you must, if you're stressed, if you're in grief and grieving, this is a great call to action, and embrace the hero's journey into and plunge into the depths, the dark night of the soul, and have faith in faith that there is something higher, and that and be able to be willing to let your ego die. And your personal ego grit is not sufficient to face the challenges that you're in, but this tragedy is the actual fuel to spring you to the second half of life, to this celestial order and becoming Christ-like. And it can be your greatest gift, even though it doesn't seem like in the moment. And it's only because you don't have enough skills to match what the grief when your child, your son, your daughter commits suicide or is killed in a car accident. Like, how do you deal with that? And your ego isn't big enough to handle it. And so this is where grace comes in and takes over, because without it, you die. Faith must overcome the grief, because giving up, abandoning all, despair overcomes, because that's your only option. But if you can allow faith to overcome it, then you will come through the other side, like the hero's journey, and become master of two worlds, overcoming the internal world, and therefore be able to, your tests can be your testimony for others to rise to the occasion. So thank you for joining us. That's all for today. We're grateful for you. We're proud of the courage that you demonstrate to live with integrity. We're going to love you and leave you. Till next time. Peace.